Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode explores veteran models of flexible work, established public sector examples where tried and tested practices have been enabling military families and federal employees to excel and thrive in their distributed deployment and civilian employment working lives. In service situations, we can recognize that distributed teamwork, performance management, and workforce wellness are interdependent and must be addressed successfully. In civilian scenarios, too, the critical issues are the same, including workplace culture, what training is accessible and incentivized, how are benefits, including cost savings, achieved and measured, how are policies communicated and interpreted so managers understand the discretion they have to adapt and achieve optimal team outcomes. The public sector has been optimizing strategic workplace flexibility for years, with both different and similar drivers and dynamics to private sector settings, so they can offer us new perspectives and insights to inform and improve our workplace policies and practices. I'm delighted to be speaking with Mika Cross, Workplace Transformation Strategist at Strategy at Work. Mika is a transformational workforce expert who has served as an enlisted soldier and commissioned officer. Her career includes assignments throughout the United States intelligence community and across the federal government, including working at the USDA and the U.S. Department of Labor. Her deep experience spans telework, workplace flexibility, employee engagement, and workforce wellness innovations and initiatives, encompassing policy guidance, program development, and implementation. Hi, Mika. How are you?
I'm doing great, Sophie. How are you doing?
I am very well, thank you. We start at the beginning. You studied communications and then went into public administration. How did that happen?
I did. Well, at one point I thought I wanted to be a journalist.
Oh.
And those were my days before service.
Okay.
And so I completed about a year and a half of journalism school in Boston, Mass. At Northeastern University before I needed to take a little break from my academic studies. And that was primarily due to financial issues, to be honest. I was working and kind of traipsing my way up and down the East Coast, went back to my home state of Maine for a little while, thinking I would maybe complete my degree at University of Maine instead of somewhere more expensive.
Okay.
And I had a mentor who suggested that I consider military service.
Okay.
In the sense that I could complete my education, see the world a little bit, get some job experience, and serve nobly. So I actually took that advice from a wonderful mentor, Charlene was her name, and raised my right hand in my home state of Bangor, Maine, and enlisted in the United States Army at that time. And so after my first duty station, I was completing night school.
Okay.
I did about a year and a half, and the commander came and talked to me about the potential of becoming an officer by competing for a scholarship that would allow me to get out of my full-time active duty commitment and go back to school on an Army scholarship while commissioning to become an officer, actually. And that's what I did.
Oh, okay. And so that was when you start an adjunct general military personnel officer. How did you choose that? What took you in that direction?
So when you're commissioning, you're sort of serving at the pleasure of the nation.
Right.
And so Uncle Sam will decide where they need you, where they want you. However, the better that you perform in 3 specific categories while you're working towards your commission as an officer, the better you get on what's called an order of merit list.
Okay.
So if you're at the top of the order of merit list, typically you get your first, second, or third choice. So I was number 3 in my entire class because I had a 4.0 GPA and I had pretty strong leadership ratings from camp. And so I did get my first choice, which out of all the branches as an officer, I felt like being a personnel officer would get me to what I thought I wanted to do, which was public affairs at some point.
Okay.
So you can't commission into public affairs. You have to first pick a specific branch, which that's the one I chose. And often you can then, when you advance in your career, go a different direction, get a secondary branch, and work in a specialty that's more suited to what you want. So that was what I was thinking. But I ended up really seeing the power of inclusive workplaces, supportive workplaces, policies, procedures, and programs that supported the whole soldier in order to get the best out of our troops, especially when they are deploying into conflict and being separated from their families and having to support the other half of that equation, which is their spouse, their families, their children, their loved ones.
You're dealing with not just the average employee. You're dealing with people who are, by definition and by default, going to be stressed to the utmost and putting their life on the line. And then, as you're saying, the other half of the equation, which is so critically important, the spouse and the family of somebody who's being deployed. So how was that?
Absolutely. And I supported, I call them the boys mostly, but at the time, this was a very rapidly deployable unit, meaning these are the folks that within 18 hours have to get their stuff, pack up, say goodbye, kiss their loved ones, and go. So I had to support those kinds of operations for about 16,000 troops globally. You want to talk about distributed teams? That's a distributed team back in the day. And so I was part of the 3rd ID, the 3rd Infantry Division. Yeah. So it's interesting because I was assigned to the Infantry Division in a support role on the personnel side. And so to become rapidly deployable and with the ability to just pick up and go, especially during that time, which was right before 9/11 and after, I started to see like the issues of supporting, again, not just the soldier and making sure that they're ready, but also the family unit and what it means if you don't. So, there's the military in our nation is really facing a critical shortage, not just of recruits, but the ability to what we call re-up. So, retention rates. And often it's contingent on making sure that, guess what? Military spouses are able to continue working if they need 2 people in the family to be able to afford today's lifestyle. And if they are left behind while their loved one is deployed and they have children, are they in the right kind of work environment that allows them to continue working and supporting in what otherwise would be considered sort of single parenting at the time? So these issues I saw directly affecting the ability to provide national security and the mission in the armed forces. And so when I did transition into federal civilian HR outside of uniform in the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time, which you mentioned, in that civilian role, it informed everything that I did through those lenses. So whether I was writing policy, whether I'm consulting with management, whether I'm working on initiatives. After 9/11, we were all in the intelligence community focused on implementing the 9/11 Commission recommendations on creating cultures of collaboration and eliminating stovepipes. And so the experience of seeing not just the impact to the soldier in making sure they're ready and have what they need, but also the whole picture in like terms of flexibility and flexible and supportive workplaces.
What were those stovepipes?
Essentially, what the 9/11 Commission found was that the structures and the cultures within the intelligence community were such that people were being rewarded and individually incentivized for the knowledge that they had. And so knowledge sharing across the community, because of a multitude of reasons, were being kept in those silos. And so the goal was to try to transition mindsets and operations in a secure environment when you're talking about top secret
Oh,
information,
interesting.
but such that where people can share and collaborate across boundaries, across agencies, across organizations for the purpose of protecting this nation better than we did before.
I talk so much about breaking down silos, working multidisciplinary teams, and that's hard in corporations when you don't have those constraints of confidentiality and other challenges to deal with. What were some of the insights and learnings that you brought from thinking about the soldier and their families in deployment when bringing that into the civilian part of a federal agency?
I think the perspective, and back in the day, we didn't call it user experience or customer experience or employee experience. But thinking about all of the structures and systems that support your workers through the lens of how they interpret them. And so it really helped me to inform, regardless of what my work was or what projects I was working on, how are people interpreting even the wording in these policies to be able to implement them successfully the way we intended. So a lot of times in HR, and I worked in EO, equal opportunity, so that in the federal government, that's Title V, Title 10 is military, Title 7 is EO and diversity, civil rights. And so there are laws and codes that guide the practices there. What's interesting, though, is that often our policies and guidelines that we're expecting managers and supervisors to follow are so bureaucratic, and they're written with language that's not very easy to interpret. So here I came bopping in, as this 20-something GS-12 initially in the federal space after serving in these capacities across the Army. And I would raise my right hand to volunteer for pretty much anything. So if they needed to update the policy, the personnel operation procedures, especially when it came to flexi-place, part-time, intermittent work, I would raise my hand and I would have the power of the pen. And you asked me about communications. So not only did I have expertise in communications, right? But I also had the perspective of what it meant on the personnel and HR side.
Fascinating.
And so I would change little words and the way that it was written so that managers could more easily implement these flexible policies the way they were intended. So instead of saying employees must not work more than 5 days in a such and such capacity, I would just change it to plain language and say managers may approve up to XYZ hours of flex time. And I started to see what I call the power of the pen in terms of how it started transitioning the workforce to transform how we were supporting our people. Because guess what? The managers who were leading them actually understood that there was more flexibility in the policies than they had assumed. And because of the more passive language and strict language, when you shifted the dialect, it opened up opportunities.
To that particular example, it was just giving the ultimate boundary. It wasn't describing the flexibility before you got to that boundary.
Right. And it wasn't written in plain language such that people could interpret the guardrails the way that they were intended.
Or just understand what they could do because there wasn't enough definition or direction and definition before that.
And you know what, Sophie? I call that, do you understand how to bend and not break the rules?
I'm English, so yes.
That's
what rules are about for the English, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. But seriously, though, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but managers, especially back in the day, and let's face it, they're still dealing with it now, felt like their decision-making processes were being taken away from them, that they weren't empowered to make the right decisions for their people because these policies restricted them. When you rewrote them in ways that they could understand and help educate them through training, conversations. We even led this campaign called Talk to HR. Or Talk with HR. We met with them every month and they could ask any questions, almost like Ask the Experts. Ask us anything about these policies so that you can make the right decisions. And we had managers, and this was back in the day in the intelligence community, who said, I have my best senior intelligence analyst who speaks Farsi and she's having a baby. And she wants to come back to work a little bit early, but she wants to prorate her FMLA. Can she do that? And I said, of course she can do that. So the law says up to X number of weeks per calendar year. You can prorate that time, absolutely, if it makes sense for her, for you, and the mission. Of course you can. But they couldn't understand it. So it takes a level of translating not just education and training, but actually making sure that people are understanding how they can implement it a little more creatively.
I'm really interested in terms of how you were implementing workplace flexibility for people, how you were advising managers to be successful in managing their teams, in showing leadership, giving them guidance, enabling their teams to be successful. What were some of the key things that you were highlighting for them? Because there wasn't that much discussion or direction or leadership training for distributed teams at that point. What were you telling them?
Well, first, I think it's important to say that, the U.S. federal government is the nation's largest employer and often employs, on average, about 2.1 million federal workers, contractors, across the board in any given year. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of different organizations within the federal government, not the federal government at large. Because what we did in the intelligence community between the 2004 and 2010 versus what I did at the Department of Agriculture versus what we did when I was at OPM looks a little different, and there are different tactics. I carried insights with me to inform the next strategy, which is kind of cool. So I think let's talk about the intelligence community first. So I wanted to dabble in all the things, which is kind of how I got my nickname, Federal Workplace Expert. So, tactically, I learned the code of federal regulations. I learned the policies, practices, and procedures that guide federal human resources management. I worked in employee management relations, performance management, drug demand reduction program, helped with staffing and classification and reviewing resumes, updating policies, all of those facets. And then I tripped my way into the work, life, and wellness and EAP. That's the employee assistance program shop. Learned components of that. Then I went over to equal opportunity and diversity, learned Title VII, and wanted to understand the strategic priorities and laws that dictate EO, civil rights, law from a compliance perspective. That information really helped inform how, from a systems approach, policies need to be integrated so that when an organization has strategic priorities and compliance requirements in equal opportunity versus HR versus budget versus whatever you may be, that you integrate those to move something forward.
That they shouldn't be in conflict with each other, but the systems approach is essential.
That's right. So my last position in the intelligence community before I went to Department of Ag was in equal opportunity and diversity. And we were looking through the framework of why are certain demographics of workers not advancing in senior ranks? Why are they attriting at higher levels, many of whom are women? And there were a lot of task force and resources going into trying to look at the barriers, which is called a barrier analysis, in order to try to eliminate that for more advancement. So what was easy to do was when you saw some of those insights is pull in the policies to say, well, if they're leaving because of these reasons, lack of flexibility, lack of career advancement, how is our workforce experiencing and using some of the policies that we already have in place? And so what we were finding was that, like, for instance, we had a policy for part-time employment. We had a policy for job sharing. 2 people in an entire organization of 16,000 people were participating in it. Same with FlexiPlace. We had the policy, and there are elements of your job, especially in support roles, which guess what? Many women sit in support roles. But their supervisors were not allowing it because carte blanche, they were saying the mission or your security clearance would not allow it, which was a falsehood. So that informed how, in terms of how do you structure the systems piece and policies piece to be able to look broadly across an organization and connect the dots. So powerful.
And how do you also help the supervisors embrace more yes, that may be available, but I'm not going to allow that, into I get it. It's not exactly what I want. We can fix the security clearance issue. And I will adapt to have the more flexible mindset in order to make the system work.
Well, that's the secret sauce there, my friend. And I will tell you, the intelligence community or pockets therein are still struggling. I just went back to DIA for Women's History Month. And, while there's improvement in recruitment of women and diverse populations, the attrition of women, like they come in, they leave as fast as we bring them in. And so the same issues systemically are the exact same issues that we were looking at back 20 years ago in terms of, and I'm telling you, people reach out to me because they know me, and I grew up with these folks. So they're saying, we still can't telework. We still can't, well, we have it, but they don't love it. It's the mindset, Sophie. It's always the mindsets. What I learned when I went to United States Department of Agriculture, which, by the way, the Secretary of Agriculture had included telework, work life, and wellness as a component of his vision for cultural transformation, and had monthly metrics to which he reviewed and held his sub-cabinet committee accountable for each and every month. That was when we started seeing a difference, because what get measures gets done. Right. And so it wasn't just telework for the purpose of telework. It was the entire vision of cultural transformation, which included how our people are learning and career mapping. Nice. How are we recruiting? What does our diversity look like? And what does our telework look like in terms of even environmental issues? So that's when we started also calculating cost savings. We started looking at attrition and retention rates, diversity hiring, and there was a lot of other metrics. Promotions and advancement, what commensurate with higher levels of all types of flexibilities, including telework.
And we talked earlier about the fact that the federal government gives people transportation costs to get to and from work. So the idea of telework is directly connected to cost savings. What were the steps that you took in implementing more or encouraging more telework, and what savings were you able to affect? Obviously, in the private sector, people aren't necessarily paying their employees to get to and from work, but these cost savings are there, obviously, on the employee side in the private sector.
Well, I do want to clarify that the transit subsidy program that Congress authorizes for federal workers in metropolitan areas isn't just paying people to get to work. It's intended to safeguard infrastructure across the nation and get people to use more public transit options like carpooling, van pooling, metro rail, and buses. So I just wanted to clarify that. And they don't pay the entire 100% of the cost. They only pay a portion, a subsidy. So, and those are in high density metropolitan areas like New York, Boston, DC. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. That's very important.
So we took a multi-pronged approach, right? So there was an internal communication and marketing perspective, but we had commitment from all across the most senior leaders. So not just the Secretary of Agriculture, but his deputy assistant secretaries, the chief human capital officer of the entire USDA. By the way, USDA, when I was there leading these programs, we had approximately 105,000 employees assigned to the Department of Agriculture in 16 different mission areas in 3,000 different facilities across the nation and around the globe. So again, distributed worldwide teams. And so leading those programs and policies required getting each of those 16 different mission areas and agencies to comply, to follow suit, and to make sure. And so a couple of approaches I'll talk about, and then I'll talk about the cost savings. One was equipping the program leads in each of those organizations with access to training in terms of how do you teach them how to manage their programs? How do you teach them how to look at the data and report it out? How do you train the trainer to make sure that they are training and translating our policies at their levels?
Yep.
How are we incentivizing that and, celebrating our wins? What are we measuring in terms of engagement, cost savings, impact to the mission, our customers, and our taxpayers? All of those things. So we also put together some very comprehensive management training versus workforce training and ensured that everybody got it. And I created it and led it. And so we also recorded it and uploaded it into our learning management systems.
Okay.
We taught people how to code their time so that we could track their time properly in terms of how many people were actually teleworking, what percentage of hours, and where. Because interestingly enough, personnel records are also assigned to facilities.
Okay.
So if we saw the ability that certain facilities were being underutilized or not utilized much, that would be an opportunity for us to not have to continue leasing some of that office space, which also would save money.
So then you had interactions with both IT and facilities management in order to be able to optimize.
And budget. So those are the first people that I made friends with when started to leading these programs, because again, from my experiences back before then, I understood the power of gaining those stakeholders buy-in and working together. So the programs weren't just mine, they were ours.
Right.
All of us had this celebration. Yeah. All of us had a pleasure play, even such that the Forest Service, which belongs to USDA, I had the Forest Service calculating the number of trees we were saving because we were able to digitize from the teleworkers that were teleworking and not printing all the paper. They had a mechanism to track that. And they were so proud because that is their mission.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, it was fabulous.
And that makes everybody feel good. Everybody in the process, because they can actually see exactly how many trees are being saved all the time.
Right.
Love that.
And that's their mission at Forest Service. So,
exactly.
They were jazzed about it, excited about it. Congress loved to use USDA as the poster child. USDA also landed on the cover, not the cover, but the Forbes Best 500 American Workplaces a couple of years in a row. We were winning industry awards from World at Work for innovative workplace programs. And the employees were proud because they saw our organization being touted by private industry as an innovative best place to work. This was 15 years ago. So I'm just saying, like, it can be done and it has been done.
Right.
And then with regards to cost savings. Please. I was looking for like low hanging fruit, like where can we get some wins here and also categorize for the taxpayer.
Sure.
How is this playing out? So I was like, I managed the transit subsidy program. And I'm thinking, well, how many of our employees here at USDA actually participate in the transit subsidy program? So out of 105,000, about 10% at best across the department were receiving a transit subsidy to get to work, which equated to about $18 million a year.
Okay.
So when we took the approach that if you could telework even just for a few hours a year, you were then technically eligible to telework, even if it was ad hoc. Okay. Because we tied it to continuity of government and continuity of operations. Even if you just had a few hours or days in a calendar year, you still were eligible to telework. Okay. The degree of which and frequency of which then would put you in an ad hoc category versus regular or recurring, which is a schedule. Okay. And so what we did then was open the aperture to have almost 70% of our workforce dictated as eligible to telework. And from there, we calculated how many people were teleworking 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. And if they were only teleworking 1, could they do 2? If they were teleworking 2, could they do 3? Okay. And if they were receiving a transit subsidy, what would they save us? In the first year after the Telework Enhancement Act was initiated into law, we were one of 3 federal agencies across the entire government, which met all compliance standards of all the requirements in that act within the first 6 months.
And was that 2014? 2010. Okay.
Yeah. And then we calculated even just cost savings as it related to transit subsidy only of savings or avoiding $8 million a year.
Wow. Nice.
And so as you expand more telework for those who participate in transit subsidy, the savings were increasing, let alone the impact to productivity, retention, reduction of utility costs, office space, and those trees that we just talked about.
Right. So very interesting how you were working, yes, not your problem, our problem, and how you're making that effective by working across those departments, which I think is one of the key steps that are very important in the private sector for HR to be connecting with these different areas. There are obviously many companies who are seeing how much can be saved in office space if we take a very thoughtful, logical approach to what do we actually need. So there are many different agencies that you work at after that: OPM, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the US Department of Labor. What were some of the other programs that you were bringing to these different departments, having had such great success in all the different ways and being recognized for that success in very different types of workforce situation? Because one size does not fit all. In different departments, you may have fewer or more employees who are distributed differently or clustered differently. So what were you able to do, and what were different constraints and opportunities that you were able to adapt to and provide new insights and improve the ways of working for those different groups of employees?
One level of complexity that I didn't highlight yet is dealing with unions and the collective bargaining agreements.
Okay.
And so, for instance, at USDA, we not only had to get through the bureaucracy of mindsets from management and helping to teach skill and rigor there and hold accountable through metrics and measurement, but we also had 92 different labor unions.
Whoa.
92.
Oh my goodness.
So if you consider the collective bargaining process for all those different unions,
that makes my head explode.
Yes. But we had a labor management council that was very well put together.
Okay.
And the goal was to engage those labor unions early, during, and after the process, such that it was a collaborative process. So we can't always, they're going to bargain on behalf of their constituents, right, and their members, but we can't give in to all of their demands, but some of them we can. And as you mentioned, the relationship pieces of ensuring that they felt included, heard, responded to. And when we had to say no, we gave them very good reason. When I went to OPM, my role was a lot different. It was initially intended to help be a consultant on these topics for the rest of government agencies in roles like mine at USDA. So helping to leverage best practices, promising practices, training opportunities, sharing resources, and that sort of thing. Interestingly, though, I was working on the human capital solution side, human resources solution side, HRS, which actually serves as internal consultants, and they charge the rest of government to get their services, their access to their training, consulting, audits, assessments. And at that time, it just didn't feel right for me because I was giving all my secrets away because I wanted the whole government to do what we were doing. So while it was wonderful to be at OPM, there are amazing folks. I'm still friends and colleagues with them, such a fan of all the work they do. It made sense for me when the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had an opportunity to stand up their work, life, and wellness portfolio. And they were considered kind of a startup. So if you recall, CFPB was sort of a passion project of Elizabeth Warren. And so when I went there, it was in their first 5 years of almost a startup. And they were trying to bring talent from Wall Street in the finance industry, as well as from across government to stand this organization up. So that was really appealing and fun to think about doing that. So I went there. They're called the FIREA, the Financial Regulatory Agencies. They have the ability and authority to offer a lot more financial incentives and benefits than any other federal agency because of their authorities. And so that was really eye-opening and interesting to bring the work, life, and wellness programs to CFPB for the purpose of attracting that top premier talent from the finance industry to come and do the job.
Whilst you've been in the USDA, huge organization, obviously, with a long history. So how is that different when you're in a startup agency, being able to then bring the new principles that you could integrate, that could create the foundation for this organization? What were you particularly excited about being able to do those foundational years?
Well, first of all, I think having the foundation of the core of those programs and how to align them with, like I said, the Telework Enhancement Act and the policies and the CFRs
Right.
that guide personnel systems was incredibly important. But then because we're in this new industry agency and sort of operating in a startup, there's also this opportunity to do things much more innovatively than you
right.
could. And it's a smaller organization and they had more resources at the time. Just a fun and different combination of being able to have like resources and funding and support. So really, I was their internal consultant.
So what were some of those innovations that you brought in, being able to experiment and having the funding to say, let's just see if this is going to work?
Yeah, I think shifting the mindset to anything is possible. Whether we had some of the offices, the field offices at CFPB who wanted to primarily operate fully remotely. And I wasn't there that long, by the way. So it's not like I had longevity like at USDA for 4.5 years. However, there was a lot of the mindsets were different. That's what I will say.
Right.
A lot of openness to trying new things, even from the labor management arm on the policy side. And you got to think this is a regulatory and compliant focused kind of agency. But they were hiring young talent.
Right.
They were hiring very bright talent from, Wall Street and the finance industry. And so that required different ways of thinking.
I'm curious as to what it was like then working in the Department of Labor.
So when I went to the Department of Labor, I went to an organization called the Veterans Employment and Training Service. And it was intentionally to take on a different role. I wanted a little break from HR and human capital.
Right.
So I was the director of strategic communications and public engagement, digital engagement.
Okay.
But focused on this mission of enabling the U.S. Department of Labor to collaborate with all of its federal stakeholders, like the VA, Department of Defense, Department of Education, HUD, among many others, to successfully enable a smooth transition for military service members who are leaving military service and joining the civilian labor market.
Interesting.
And including supporting their spouses.
Oh, okay.
So that was a very interesting pivot for me while still being able to bring in my expertise on the, remote work side, flexible work side, human capital perspective. In terms of how are we messaging all these services. The other thing that I was doing was working with all of our private industry and nonprofit partners. So I ran the Secretary of Labor's Federal Advisory Group on Veterans Employment and Training. And there I worked with partners from the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Legion, helmets to hard hats. And that started really just resonating with me from a perspective of how are we equipping the right kinds of skills for people who were working in a certain trade to be able to successfully transition to a new job, many of whom don't want to do the same jobs that they did in the military. So if you were a truck driver in the military, often you want nothing to do with that when you go to work, in hometown USA. But on the other side of it was thinking about how do you work with employers to offer flexible pathways to employment for military spouses and for transitioning service members who are going back home. And that really required a different mindset around flexible careers, maybe opportunities in telework, hybrid, remote, options for remote, part-time, flexibility at large. And it required partnership across the entire Department of Labor. We were working with BLS, looking at the data and the numbers, like what do our rates look like for employment for veterans of this demographic, veterans with disabilities, caregivers, military spouses. We worked with the Women's Bureau. We worked with ETA, the benefits side of the house.
As you're reaching out to lots of different private enterprises, what was their responsiveness to some of your requests? Obviously, there is enormous openness, although not all embracing of veterans, very much appreciative of veterans. And also, I know that it hasn't been as easy for enterprises to feel that they can integrate veterans for very specific reasons. You're asking people to have a more flexible approach, to have some more openness, to be thinking about how they can be bringing people in, integrating back into civilian life. What were the things that resonated the most, and where were some of the biggest roadblocks for corporations trying to understand how to do this?
I think a couple things come to mind when answering that question. First, often what was surprising to me is that a lot of veterans choose to go back home to hometown USA.
Okay.
And guess what? A lot of times those hometowns are in rural communities across the country and not close to metropolitan areas, like in my hometown of Maine, where there are not a lot of employment opportunities.
Right.
And so you're thinking about going back home to what we called hometown USA, where the majority, 80% probably, are going back into rural or rural metropolitan areas. So the job opportunities there are a lot fewer anyway, unless you have flexible options, right?
Right.
Like
Yes.
So that. And then you have to deal with the complexity of stereotypes of employers who make assumptions that all veterans come to work with PTSD and they're combat veterans and they could be a risk to the workforce. That's a negative stigma that we have to overcome and sort of normalize the issue that we're all struggling in this environment with mental health and well-being issues. And we all need to create thriving, healthy, supportive workplaces in order to have a healthy, thriving, supportive workforce. So that. The other thing is that, interestingly, many women veterans do not self-identify as veterans.
Okay.
So if you teach employers to ask the question a little differently, like, have you ever served in the armed forces?
Okay.
Then women will recognize that, yes, I did serve. Because again, the assumption is when you say the word veteran, many people assume combat veteran or male veteran that had been to war.
Right.
So many women may say, oh, well, I didn't serve in combat, so no, I'm not a veteran, but I did serve. So why I say that is because there are some compliance statutes for instance, federal contractors. If you have more than 100 workers, you need to be hiring a certain percentage of your workforce as veterans.
Oh, okay.
And so like that could help increase diversity of talent if you ask the question differently as well. So those first three things. The other thing is that the military spouse, yet again, is sometimes more than half of the equation. The reason why a service member will stay in service or why they will leave, and if they leave, where they go.
Okay.
To settle in. And so it's very important for us to be considering the underemployment and unemployment rates of military spouses and consider it an issue of national security. And because of the transient nature of their roles, to be able to equip their service members to be able to perform the duties of their mission while in uniform. And also as they transition, supporting military spouses, I think is our duty, our responsibility as well as taking care of those who served. So in my opinion, opening the mindsets of employers in terms of what kind of talent you're getting, what kind of leadership skills, no matter what their occupation or industry was. And also, if you have jobs that are suitable to be done in a remote capacity, could you be leveraging those remote jobs for the purpose of attracting and hiring an amazing skill set of talent from either military spouses or transitioning veterans?
Completely agree. And when we spoke before, you also raised the very valid point that whilst there are challenges, many issues discussed about the hollowing out of CBDs because people are working remotely. Rural communities have been hollowed out. There were many different jobs in smaller communities that have lost those jobs because people went to the central business districts, they went to the larger metropolitan areas. And so we have already been dealing with different challenges of migrating workers. So I'd love to hear a few comments that you have on that, since you've been dealing with it from the veteran perspective, but from an employee distribution perspective for the spouses as well.
Yeah. Well, and absolutely. And when I worked for Flex Jobs as the vice president of employer engagement, I was working with employers of all sizes, types, industries, from mom and pop startups to Fortune 100 and 500 to nonprofit, academia, you name it. And so considering the fact that many rural communities have been dissipated because of what we call the rural brain drain, in terms of people who get educated, they grow up, and then they leave to go find where the jobs are. It's a big impact to our nation, to our communities across the country. Even my home state of Maine has dealt with this for years and years. And so when we think about reshifting and rethinking the model of what work and careers can look like, we're looking at wild opportunity for our nation to rebuild and put emphasis in areas of the country that sort of have been left behind in the past. And even when you consider like the aging population of America and also older workers staying longer, trying to continue working, this can really create opportunity, not just for employers, but for those communities where they live, if they're able to continue working, continue contributing their tax base to the infrastructure, and rebuilding and reimagining what our hometown USAs can look like all around the country.
We now have the opportunity to map and distribute people where they want to be and where work can be. And there's so much more, as you said. I love that. Wild opportunities about what we can do and how we can do it now. I do want to then go to something you mentioned earlier that I think you have a keen eye on as well, which is this reskilling, whether dealing with people who have served, the reskilling coming into the civilian workforce. You've been thinking about that, which is both upskilling and reskilling, and people who are wanting to move into different areas, different industries, whatever job they were doing, as you said, in the service. We have this huge skilling, upskilling, reskilling, changing of what skills are needed for the jobs that people are in right now. How do you look at that with the experience that you have?
I think in this jobs economy right now, what employers need most of all are not solely the technical skills, but what we used to call soft skills. And so I like to now call them success skills. And these are skills that any worker needs in any industry and occupation. And these are really coming out as the forefront of what can set you apart from someone else. Things like critical thinking, autonomous working, work ethic, conflict resolution skills, interpersonal, intergenerational skills.
Right.
Are we communicating well in a professional way? Do we have a customer-centric focus?
How do you think employers of all kinds can best address this? It is such a key issue that you have dealt with in much of your work. Even in terms of putting the skills of, I can work remotely, I can work independently, which is a new issue that I have been asked about. How do I put that on my resume? How do I communicate that I'm good at flexible working, that I'm good at remote working? What are some of the key ways that you see employers and workers of whatever their employment arrangement, how are they trying to address it as well?
First of all, I am a firm believer in investing in career readiness skills early and often.
Right.
So to me, that looks like looking at your good old Department of Education and even at the local levels and figuring out, are we equipping our youth with the right sets of skills to be able to communicate, to be able to connect, to be able to understand what's expected of you in a job, in a professional job. And I don't care if that's a trade job or if it's a job that you have to go to college for. Workers need help understanding how to work, okay? Number one. And secondly, investing early and often in reinforcing these kinds of skills, but also the behaviors, is incredibly important. And so as we think about the adoption of new technology and generative AI, and this also opens up opportunities. So for instance, employers could be leveraging skills-based assessments to move towards a more skills-based talent economy, and thinking about, like, does Mika have the attributes of being able to learn the technical skills? So it's not necessarily the technical skills. It's like, is this a fit? Does she have the aptitude to work with customers? Is she warm, empathetic, open? Are these the kinds of leaders that we want to hire for? So shifting the mindset just from what is your background? What experience do you have from there? Versus what is your aptitude and skill set to be able to learn and apply what I need you to, with a forward-focused approach, is where I think the money's at when you're thinking about success skilling for the future and reskilling and upskilling.
And last question, with all your experience of government, with all your experience of flexible working, workplace flexibility, all the different elements that umbrella encompasses, when you're looking towards the private sector as well as the public sector, what are your thoughts in terms of how the leader of an institution or an organization should be thinking about it? How should they best be approaching it for their workforce?
I think first and foremost, take a look at what happens if you don't.
Okay.
Think about what happens if you don't. Look at the level of tax on the workforce that's left behind when you have high attrition rates or high frequency of turnover. The skills and organizational and tacit knowledge that's lost and left out the door. Your impact on your ability to perform for your customers, stakeholders. And so why not extend a little trust and autonomy first, hold accountable second, and teach the skill that you want to incentivize, and model a flexible, open mindset. Because I'll answer that question if you don't. Someone else will scoop up your talent, and it's often the best ones that can leave like that.
Beautifully put. I knew you'd have a great answer for that. Mika, thank you so much. You have shared so much from a unique journey that you have had. I haven't actually interviewed anybody with as much government experience, and it's absolutely fascinating. You've learned and implemented and experimented with so much with great success. So I really, really appreciate everything that you shared and all the insights and some great final advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Sophie.
Thanks again so much to Mika Cross, Workplace Transformation Strategist at Strategy at Work. You can find out more about Mika on LinkedIn and her company website, mikacross.com, MIKACROSS.com. Immediate action tip. If you don't include flexibility in your work policies and turnover increases, recognize the burden on employees who stay and the loss of skills and organizational knowledge. Instead, extend a little trust and autonomy first, hold people accountable second, and teach flexible, open mindsets. If you are finding the new business and work environment hard to navigate, reach out for executive mentorship as well as effective empathy-centered programs to enable multi-generational distributed leaders, managers, and teams to up-level rapidly for modern work and be ready for whatever lies ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.